Hello. Like we said before, Marlowe is designed to be as secure as possible in more than one way, but it's still possible to make Marlowe contracts that don't behave as you expect them to behave. Even worse, even if the Marlowe contract you write behaves in the way you expect it to behave in normal scenarios when every participant is collaborating, that's not enough. It also needs to behave correctly and fairly when participants are not collaborating, when participants are trying to trick each other or they are trying to trick the contract. This is especially true because smart contracts, like normal contracts, are often used in situations where parties don't trust each other. Let's look at some of the things that could go wrong.
Marlowe contracts are mainly used to manage assets, so one obvious problem is that assets may get stuck on the contract. Marlowe rules out some things straight out of the bat. For example, it's impossible to have infinite loops in Marlowe because contracts always terminate, in the sense that a transaction always terminates and a contract also terminates because every contract in Marlowe has a predefined timeout after which it will close. However, even though timeouts are always bounded for Marlowe contracts, nothing prevents timeouts from being arbitrarily far in the future, for example, 200 years from now, which arguably is just as bad. So it's important to use reasonable timeouts. For example, in this contract, we have set the timeout to be after the year 4022. So we can only expect it to terminate if one of the cases in the when happens. And that may be impossible for a number of reasons. For example, we may have a notification which cannot be satisfied, or we may have no cases at all in the when, or we may have a choice which is to be made by someone that has lost their private key, for example, and that will lock the contract arbitrarily long time. Something arguably less bad is that instead of assets getting stuck in the contract, is that assets go to the wrong party. But at least in this case, assets are not necessarily lost forever, because if the party collaborates, you could still get them back. Again, Marlowe does some things to make it harder to some extent. For example, payments are explicit. You have a pay function which says how much is going to be paid to whom, and through static analysis you can make sure that this is possible. But the main problem probably is with close, which is actually not explicit. So close can actually do payments, and it depends on the state of the contract, so it's not obvious who is going to be paid. For that reason, we have added a static analysis tool that Lars has shown before, which is called refund on close, which allows you to force yourself to be explicit about every payment and not rely on the capabilities of close to refund money. We will see an example later of how to take advantage of this feature without renouncing to the benefits of the close automation. Another thing that Marlowe provides is a tolerant way of handling failures. So for example, if a payment is done without having enough money, instead of the contract just stopping working and aborting every transaction, what it does is it pays as much as possible from the account that you are trying to pay. So on the one hand, it tries to be as close as possible to the original intention of the contract and tries to pay as close the amount as possible as it was specified in the contract. But at the same time, it takes care that this miscalculation doesn't affect the calculations on other accounts. So it will never take money from accounts that are not in the paid statement. Likewise, if you happen to have in the contract a negative deposit, it would be impossible in principle to take the case because you cannot possibly do a negative deposit into a contract. So the semantics will interpret that negative deposit as a zero deposit. So it will act like a trivial choice in that it allows you to take that branch and it still remains as close as possible to the original intention. But it still keeps the guarantee that the only way of getting money out of the contract is either through a pay construct or through close. This is an example of a negative deposit. You can see that there is a payment to the depositor that would probably be in their benefit that is protected by a negative deposit. If it was just impossible to make a negative deposit, then it would be impossible for the depositor to get any money at all. But because the deposit is interpreted as a zero deposit, then the depositor can just make a transaction that triggers the payment. Another problem is that the logic in the contract may just be wrong. So for example, you may have an if statement and the observation in the if statement is wrong. So the branch that the contract is going to take is not the one you expect it to take. This is probably the hardest issue to overcome. But these are things that you could try to reduce the likelihood of this happening. One is to try to express what you mean in different ways, so using different logical constructs or using different procedures. And then you can compare them, and you can use static analysis to do this. Another advice is to try to keep things as simple as possible, because the simpler it is, the easier it is to understand, the easier it is to keep in your head all at once and reason about it, and the fewer the chances that there are of making a mistake. Also, if you find yourself making assumptions, write them as assertions. We will look at the assert construct later and how to use static analysis to ensure that your assumptions are right. And finally, test. Just use the simulator to go through all the possibilities and check all the edge cases, all the possible combinations, all the corners in your code to make sure that each of them behaves as you expect. Finally, another thing to consider is the potential inability to participate in the contract. Because on the one hand, we have to design Marlowe contracts so that if a party decides not to participate, they cannot stall the contract. The other side of the coin is that a party may not be able to participate in the contract, and that may have negative consequences for the party, because we usually penalize non-cooperation. And there are several reasons why this may happen. The obvious one is that timeouts may be too tight, and it's easy to underestimate the time it takes to be able to make a transaction. Also, there may be extraordinary circumstances that prevent you from doing the transaction on time, so we must allow for a buffer so that in case those circumstances happen, there's still time for the parties to contribute. Some of the reasons this may happen is, for example, the network may get congested if there is a lot of traffic, the internet connection for the party may fail, the power supply may fail, the party could be hacked, the party's computer may be hacked, the computer of the party may be broken for some reason, and they may have to find a different computer, they may have to find a different place, a different internet connection, and that could take more than one day. So it seems a good idea that the difference between one timeout and the next timeout should be at least one day. And also they must be different. So one timeout cannot be the same as the next timeout, because then one party can force another party into a timeout. And this is where we must start thinking adversarially. So for example, let us consider the arbitration mechanism in the escrow contract. First, the buyer is supposed to report a problem or confirm whether everything went okay. And if the buyer reports a problem, then the seller has the opportunity to either confirm there was a problem or dispute it. In this particular example, we have set both timeouts to be the same. So a malicious buyer could just wait as long as possible before the timeout before making an answer, and that would leave no time to the seller to answer to the dispute. And you can see in the contract that if the seller doesn't respond on time, the buyer is actually refunded. So that would be detrimental to the seller. So it's important we give extra time to the seller to respond in addition to the one we gave to the buyer. A more esoteric example is about inputs being able to be in the same transaction. In this contract, we first allow player 1 to make the first chance choice, and then we allow either the player 1 or the player 2 to do the choice second chance. And it would seem that both player 1 and player 2 have equal choice of getting the second chance choice. But actually, because Marlowe allows several inputs per transaction, it would be possible for player 1 to send both first chance and second chance in the same transaction, thus making it impossible for player 2 to make the choice second chance at all. So this is another example of why we need to think about contracts like if we were adversaries.